Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. I want to talk today for a minute about grief and grieving for those that are hurting right now. Grief is one of the most beautiful emotions that our hearts can bring us in times of pain and devastation. It's a reminder of all the things, right, that we have loved, and it comes to usher us through our darkness and eventually to lead us towards the healing that all human hearts long for. Sometimes people get stuck in grief for many years, and sometimes people move through grief differently. There's the grief that comes with an acute devastation or trauma, something that's happened that's fresh, that our hearts are aching over. And then there's a grief that we sometimes carry chronically for many years, sometimes a grief of our own loss of ourselves and our identity after a devastation and a trauma. So there's a lot of different layers to grief, and a lot of different things to be aware of and to just sort of understand when it comes to grief and grieving. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today. Some of the things that I have to say you may have heard before. I'm sure you probably have. And some of the things I have to say you may never have heard before, or you may not have thought of in such a way. And so I want to just give us some reminders of some things that can be helpful, or that have been helpful to me when it comes to grief and grieving. And I want to say too that all of this is just, these are just options. If this is useful to you or to someone that you love, then that's wonderful. I invite you to take it into your heart and use it to help yourself heal. And if it's not useful for you, then that's okay. Everyone's different. We all have different wants and needs and different ways of going through grieving. And so I want you to, I want to invite you to honor yourself in all of it. Grief does not come without pain, right? There are things that are helpful when it comes to the process of grieving, and there are things that are not helpful. There is no manual for grief. There is no rule book for how we choose to go through it. But there are options. And we each have the human right to choose what feels right and useful to each of us as we move through all of this. So if you're hurting right now, I just want you to know that any emotion that you are feeling is valid, and that you are and have always been 100% lovable, 100% worthy of every good thing in this world, whether you believe that right now or not. And I just want to say that that includes the right to a healing process that is yours, that feels authentic to you, and that meets your unique needs and wants. So I want you to know that I love you and that you are loved and supported in this world, and I want to invite you to give that gift to yourself as well if you want to. And I want to share with you some of my observations and some of the things that I have found useful in all of this. So there is the emotion of grief, and then there is the process of grieving. There are things, like I said, that are helpful in navigating that process, and then there are things that often come up that are not helpful. Sometimes these not helpful things come from family, from friends, from society, even if they are well-intentioned. And sometimes they can actually come from things that we pile onto our own plates that we don't really have to do if we don't want to. And I think sometimes we don't always see it or have awareness of that. So I want to talk about that a little bit too. I wanted to just take a moment to be very intentional about telling you that the thing you may or may not already know, which is that you have a full and complete permission to move through this process however you want to move through it. You have permission to decide for yourself what is going to serve you and what feels useful in healing for you. And you have permission to let everything else go. No one else's judgments, opinions, or expectations matter. This is your pain. This is your healing, your process to decide what and how you want to move through it. There is no right or wrong way to do it. and you get to trust yourself in all of it. One of the things that I believe can be unhelpful when it comes to the process of grieving is that it should look a certain way. That it should involve crying and wearing black clothes, laying in bed, eating ice cream, gathering with friends or family, going through certain stages and in a certain way, in a certain order, and that it should take approximately X amount of time depending on the circumstance. What I notice is that when we start to buy into these metrics of what grieving should look like, we often stop listening to ourselves. We stop listening to our own wisdom, our own internal needs, and we can be tempted to move away from honoring what our unique process for grieving is going to look like. We can start comparing and thinking that we're doing it wrong somehow, or worrying about what other people will think about how we respond and what we're doing or not doing. Right? Everyone responds to grief differently, and your response does not need to look like anyone else's. Right? You don't have to go to the potluck if you don't want to go to the potluck. You don't have to stand up and sign petitions or be an activist if you don't want to do that. And for those that do want to do that, they're not doing it wrong either. Some people I have watched lose spouses or children, and people think they should be crying more. They don't seem very upset. I think they're just doing this or doing that or shoving it away or ignoring it, right? Some people want to be around friends and family, and some people don't. Some people want to be alone. And just because you're choosing to be alone, that doesn't have to mean that you're disconnecting from your own grief, from your emotions, from your pain. Some people want to talk to people about what happened. Some people want to express their emotions in a journal and not to another person. There is no right or wrong way. Everyone responds to grief differently, and your response does not need to look like anyone else's. It's yours to hold, it's yours to nurture, and only you know what is best for you. Others can hold a sacred space for you and be with you in that grief if you want them to. But no one gets to tell you what that should look like. There are no rules or requirements for you in any of this. The other thing I want to say in all of this is that when we are grieving for something, one of the things that can make grief so difficult and so complicated is that we're rarely just grieving for one thing. One of the things about grief is that it can have a reach that is deep and wide and far-reaching in its scope. Understanding that you are likely grieving for other things too, far beyond the immediate and actual loss of that thing that's right in front of you, front and center in your mind, that can allow us to have some compassion and some patience for ourselves in this process that is often so much bigger than we may even be able to see in the moment. You may be grieving the loss of a loved one or a child and their presence in your life. But you may also be grieving the loss of their future, the loss of your future with them, the loss of the dreams that you had together with someone, the loss of your own identity as a parent, a spouse, a sister, a protector, a nurturer. And you may be even having deeply complicated emotions around many other aspects of this grief. These things change our lives so profoundly. And so you may be grieving the loss of a way of life together with someone. The loss of your family unit as it once was, the loss of your family identity in addition to your own. You may be grieving the loss of trust in your community, in your country, your church, your faith. And so I just want to mention this briefly because having an awareness of that can feel really important. An awareness of all the other things that are actually tied into this grief. Because I know for me, I spent many years having difficulty healing my grief because there were components that I didn't understand that were really lying underneath it all. And right now, that may not be the most important thing for you, especially if it's an acute grief that's right here, right now. But I just wanted to mention it because there may be a day that feels useful to you to understand. It can honor pieces of this grief that you may not have known were there at first. So I just want to put that into your mind, if it's useful. The last thing that I want to offer you, again, if it feels useful, is the profound value that I have found that can exist for us in creating a sacred space for yourself to feel your grief. And the difference as well between clean pain and unnecessary suffering. Grief and pain are very natural emotions that our body brings to us after a devastation occurs. They exist in order to guide us through a necessary process to eventually be able to find healing from things that have altered our hearts and our lives, often in traumatic ways. We want to feel grief when something happens like this. We want to be in pain when something like this happens. We don't want to feel happy about tragedy in our lives or the things that we love. We often feel anger as well, and that's a totally normal and natural part of grief as well. Anger is the beginning of advocacy, and it can also move us forward at times. One of the most useful and healing things that we can do, both for ourselves and for others that are going through this process of grieving, is to create a sacred space for these emotions, for the person, and for the process that they're going through. What I often see happen, though, is that sacred space that is so foundational, really, to the healing, it often gets kind of muddied and sort of violated in these unintentional ways. And it can impede that process of healing for that to happen more smoothly. So this can happen when well-intentioned people perhaps try to make someone feel better or give them advice. I don't recommend doing that unless they have specifically asked for it. That is one of the quickest ways to, again, often unintentionally desecrate that sacred space that exists specifically in order for those emotions of pain and grief to be felt and honored. We don't want to try to remove them or pull them away when they're there in that space trying to be felt and healed and honored, right? We want to honor that. It's not the time to try and replace the emotion. There are times for healing and moving on, and there are also times for staying in something, and healing in the staying is really important as well. So I can't possibly understand what someone is going through that has lost a parent or a child or that has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, because I have not directly experienced those things. And even if I had, this part is important, even if I had, my experience of that grief and that pain is still going to be different than yours, because I'm a different person, and we each have our own unique responses and experiences of all of these things, right? What I can do is I can sit with a person if they want it, and I can hold a safe space and that sacred container for them to be in that pain, to be in that grief, to be seen, to be held, to be honored, and not alone. But I do want to say something specific to those that may be going through grief right now. And that is that you have a right to defend your sacred space, if you want to. You have a right to tell people what you need and what you want, and to tell them what you don't need and what you don't want. You don't have to if you don't have the bandwidth for that right now, but you certainly have the right to. Your voice, your needs, your experience in all of this matters. I see a lot of people that are taking care of everyone else and trying to honor society standards and expectations and what other people think they should be doing. And I just want to tell you that you don't have to do that if you don't want to. That your experience matters and you get to choose what feels best for you. And again, the last component of this section that I want to share with you about the sacred space is the difference between clean pain and unnecessary suffering. And I want to share this with you because I sometimes see people muddy up their own sacred space for healing with unnecessary suffering that makes the process harder and more painful. Clean pain is pain that we feel when someone dies or when a partner maybe tells us that they want a divorce. And you still love them, you still want to be together, right? And so there's pain there. That's clean pain. And this, sometimes what happens is that we add on to that clean pain, we add on to it all this unnecessary suffering of shame or self-judgment, for example. So I see people add suffering to a divorce when they start to shame themselves and believe that they're worthless, they're unlovable, right? And so there would be the pain of separation, but they bring in the pain of shame and unworthiness. And I want to submit to you that that part is optional. We don't have to do that. You can if you want to. It's all valid. You get to choose. But when we do that, I just want to invite you to see how we're adding suffering to an experience that could otherwise be holy and healing. This gets in the way of being able to simply grieve the loss of the thing in a clean way, because now that sacred space, that is there to feel grief and heal that grief, that's being called to be healed, by the way, right? It's now being taken up with self-shaming, right? And it's taking up, that shame is taking up space in that sacred space, that sacred container. And we do have permission to skip that if we want to. We don't have to shame ourselves. Sometimes when a parent loses a child, self-judgment and guilt can come piling into that sacred space so quickly we may not even notice it's happening. And it's so easy to start beating ourselves up for what we think we should have done differently, or berating ourselves for how it was our fault somehow, and our brain starts going to that space. And when our brain starts going into that area, I want to just invite you to consider that we may be pulling ourselves out of that sacred space where healing can happen. There are literally hundreds of variations for how we can create this kind of additional suffering for ourselves through all these kinds of non-healing emotions that are really only just weighing us down. And they're really not probably serving us in the highest form when it comes to healing. So grief and pain, these can be really healing emotions. But for the most part, shame and self-judgment, those things aren't actually guiding us towards healing. I would submit to you that they may actually be getting in the way of the healing. So getting some help if you want to, and support with that if you want to, might be something to consider if it serves you. That pure pain and grief is longing to be felt, but again, sometimes it gets bulldozed over with the shame and the judgment. So I just want to allow you to think about that, that at times that might be taking away from the holiness of that experience, and we may not realize it's happening. And so I don't want anyone that might be experiencing this to feel bad or judge themselves any further, right? Because again, it's just an observation that I see sometimes, that we create more suffering for ourselves when we do this. And so I want you to know that it's normal, that it's so common. We have human brains. This is what our brains are going to do. It's very normal. You're not doing anything wrong, right? There's no right or wrong way to move through grief. And whatever you're feeling is valid. It's whatever you're feeling, it's okay. And if that's something that you want to be in, or that you feel is serving you in some way, that's your journey. That's your journey, my love. But I think sometimes we do this shame and the judgment because we think that we have to, right? That we think we have to beat ourselves up somehow. And it's like we feel guilty to love ourselves. We feel guilty to have compassion for ourselves. And I just want to say that you have permission to do that if you want to. You have permission to treat yourself well, to treat yourself with love and compassion and trust if you want to. So I simply want to offer this as something, again, that I often see, and to point out that I do believe it enhances our pain rather than healing it. And so I just want to tell you that you have permission to move through this grief without the shame and judgment piece, if you choose to. And you can always get support with that if you feel that you need it. Again, it's your journey. Sometimes we think, again, that we have to shame ourselves, and I just want to tell you that you really don't. You don't have to. It doesn't make you a bad person to love yourself in the midst of this hard thing. I want to tell you that you have complete and total permission to love yourself through all of this, to trust yourself completely. You have permission to hold yourself compassionately and to tend to your pain in exactly the way that it is asking to be tended to, right? From your own wisdom, your own intuition, with love and with care. And you have permission to create a safe space for yourself that is sacred and non-judgmental in every way, if you want to. It's available to you. And that's just what I have to offer you today about grief and grieving, right? That there are things that are helpful and useful, and there are things that aren't, right? That there's no right or wrong way to do it, that you get to decide what's right for you, and that if you choose to, that there may be an option for you to move through this pain in a way that's less muddied, if we're able and desire to create a safe space where we treat ourselves with love and compassion, and also with trust, trusting ourselves and trusting this journey. I love you all. I love you all so much, and I'm here for you if anybody needs me. All right, take care. Treat yourself well. That's my recommendation if you want it. All right, talk soon.